You think you know what greed looks like? Wait until you hear what these doctors did to a man they thought had nothing. 3 months before the hospital shut down, Raymond Grant checked himself in wearing torn clothes and a broken watch. He told them he had no insurance, no family, no money. What they said about him when they thought he couldn't hear, that changed the course of 57 lives. So glad you're here. Before the story starts, please like and subscribe. And one more thing, drop your location in the comments. Are you watching from Chicago, Accra, maybe Montego Bay or Dublin? Let us know. Now, let me take you back to a cold Monday morning in January, in a city called Millhaven, about an hour east of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Millhaven was one of those towns that used to be something. Steel mills, union jobs, Friday night football games where the whole town showed up and the parking lot smelled like grilled onions and burning leaves. But by the time this story takes place, most of that was gone. The mills had closed. The jobs had left. Half the storefronts on Main Street were boarded up, and the only thing that seemed to be growing was the weeds in the cracks of the sidewalks. But Millhaven still had its hospital, Millhaven General. It sat on a hill at the east end of town, a wide brick building with a flat roof and narrow windows that always looked slightly gray, even when the sun was out. It had been there since 1961, and for decades it was the beating heart of the community. The place where babies were born, where broken bones got set, where old people spent their last good days looking out at the hills. Folks in Millhaven trusted that hospital the way you trust a church. It was theirs. But things had changed at Millhaven General, and not for the better. About 5 years before this story begins, the hospital was bought by a private medical corporation called Ether Health Partners. They came in with promises: new equipment, better pay, more specialists. And for the first year, things did get a little better. They put in a new MRI machine. They repainted the lobby. They added a coffee station in the waiting room that had 4 different kinds of creamer. But then the cuts started. First it was staff. Then it was supplies. Then it was time. Doctors were told to see more patients in less time. Nurses were told to do more with less. The pharmacy started running out of basic medications. The maintenance crew was cut from 12 to 4. The hallways started smelling like bleach trying to cover up something worse. And the executives from Ether Health Partners, who worked from a glass office building 3 states away, kept sending emails about efficiency metrics and profit margins and patient throughput. The man who ran the hospital day to day was Dr. Philip Renner. He was the chief administrator, 53 years old, tall, always in a pressed gray suit with a blue tie, and shoes so shiny you could see your face in them. He had thin lips and a way of smiling that never quite reached his eyes. He drove a white Mercedes that he parked in a reserved spot right by the front entrance. He called the nurses by their last names and the janitors not at all. He had a framed motivational poster in his office that said, "Excellence is a choice." And he had made his choice a long time ago. His choice was money. Under Renner's leadership, Millhaven General had become 2 hospitals. There was the hospital for people with good insurance, private rooms, quick service, warm blankets, doctors who made eye contact and asked how you were feeling. And there was the hospital for everyone else. Shared rooms with curtains that didn't close all the way, wait times that stretched past 4 hours. Nurses so overworked they could barely stop to explain a diagnosis. Patients who were discharged too soon because their beds were needed for someone whose insurance paid better. And nobody talked about it. Because that's how these things work. The rot happens slowly, one small cut at a time, one policy change, one corner cut, one patient rushed out. Until one day you look up and realize the place you trusted isn't what you thought it was anymore. But what happened next changed everything. Because into that hospital walked Raymond Grant. Now, let me tell you about Raymond. Not the version of him that checked into Millhaven General. The real version. The one nobody in that town knew about. Raymond Grant was 68 years old. He stood 6'1", but he had a way of folding himself smaller, rounding his shoulders, tucking his chin, making himself invisible when he wanted to be. He had deep brown skin, a short gray beard that he kept neat most of the time, and eyes that were so dark they looked almost black. There was a scar on his left hand, across the knuckles, from a factory accident he had when he was 19 years old, back when he was working his first real job at a bottling plant in Cleveland for $6.35 an hour. That was a long time ago. Since then, Raymond Grant had built a company called Cornerstone Industrial from a one-room office with a folding table into one of the largest private manufacturing firms in the Midwest. He held patents on 14 different industrial processes. He owned property in 6 states. His net worth, as of the last private valuation, was $1.7 billion. But here is the thing about Raymond that the magazines never wrote about and the business reporters never understood. Raymond didn't live like a billionaire. He lived in the same 4-bedroom house in Shaker Heights that he had bought in 1994. He drove a 10-year-old Ford pickup. He wore boots that he resold every 2 years at the same cobbler on Lee Road. He ate breakfast every morning at a diner called Mac's, where the coffee was burnt and the eggs were perfect, and nobody knew his last name. He had been married once. His wife, Corinne, was a school teacher. She taught 3rd grade at a public school in East Cleveland for 22 years. She was the kind of woman who saved every birthday card she ever received and kept them in a shoebox under the bed. She had a gap in her front teeth, and a habit of humming while she graded papers, and a way of looking at Raymond that made him feel like the luckiest man alive, even on his worst days. Corinne got sick in 2016. Pancreatic cancer. She spent her last 4 months in a hospital in Cleveland, and what Raymond saw during those 4 months changed him forever. He saw how they treated her when the diagnosis turned terminal. The way certain doctors stopped making eye contact. The way one nurse left her call button out of reach for an entire afternoon. The way a billing clerk came into her room while she was receiving chemotherapy to ask about a disputed insurance claim. Corinne was lying in a bed with poison dripping into her veins, and someone was standing over her asking about a $1,200 charge. Raymond sat in that room and held his wife's hand and watched it all. And something inside him shifted. Not broke, shifted. Like a foundation that moves just enough that every wall in the house is different afterward. Corinne passed on a Wednesday morning in September. She was 61. Raymond was sitting beside her. He was holding her hand. The last thing she said to him was, "Be useful, Ray. Don't just be rich. Be useful." And Raymond had been trying to keep that promise ever since. But Marcus had no idea what was coming, because Raymond's reason for being in Millhaven was not random. 6 months before Raymond checked into that hospital, he received a letter. It came to his office in a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single, handwritten page. It was from a woman named Teresa Colvin. Teresa was a nurse at Millhaven General. She was 39, a single mother with 2 boys, and she had been working at the hospital for 11 years. She had written to Raymond because she had read an article about his wife, about what happened to Corinne in the hospital, about the foundation Raymond had quietly started in her name, the Corinne Grant Foundation for Patient Dignity. Teresa's letter was 3 paragraphs long. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for help. She just told him what was happening. She told him about the 2 hospitals inside one building. She told him about patients being discharged before they were stable because their insurance ran out. She told him about a 13-year-old boy named Deshaun, who came in with a broken arm and waited 9 hours in the emergency room because his mother was on Medicaid and the doctors kept taking privately insured patients first. She told him about Dr. Renner and the profit reports and the coffee station with 4 kinds of creamer in a lobby where the ceiling tiles in the back hallways were stained brown with water damage. The last line of her letter said, "Somebody needs to see this, not from the outside, from the inside." Raymond read that letter 4 times. Then he called his lawyer. Then he called his doctor. Then he started planning. And that single moment set off a chain of events nobody could stop. On a Monday morning in January, Raymond Grant walked into the emergency room at Millhaven General, wearing a pair of worn canvas pants, a flannel shirt with a frayed collar, an old brown coat with a broken zipper, and a wristwatch with a cracked face that had stopped at 4:17. He had let his beard grow out for 3 weeks. He carried no wallet, no identification, no insurance card. He told the intake clerk his name was Ray Coleman. He said he had been having chest pains for 2 days. He said he had no insurance, no family, no doctor. The intake clerk, a young woman named Molly, looked at him over the top of her computer screen. She typed something. She didn't ask about his chest pains. She asked about payment. He said he couldn't pay. She typed something else. Then she pointed to the waiting area and said, "Have a seat. It might be a while." Raymond sat down in a plastic chair in that waiting room and began to wait. He waited for 3 hours and 41 minutes. During that time, he watched 7 other patients arrive. 4 of them were seen within 30 minutes. They had private insurance cards. They were escorted to examination rooms by a nurse who called them by their first names and offered them water. The other 3, like Raymond, were told to sit and wait. One of them was an elderly woman with a swollen ankle who kept shifting in her chair because the pain was making her nauseous. Nobody checked on her for over 2 hours. Now here is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. When Raymond was finally brought to an examination room, the nurse who checked his vitals was Teresa Colvin. She didn't know who he was. She had written her letter to the Corinne Grant Foundation, not to Raymond personally. She had never seen a photo of him. To her, he was just another patient that the system was going to fail. She took his blood pressure. She checked his pulse. She asked about his chest pains with genuine concern, leaning forward, making eye contact, touching his arm gently. She said, "I'm going to make sure someone sees you soon, okay?" And she meant it. Raymond could tell. Some people say things to fill silence. Teresa said things because she meant them. But the doctor who came in 40 minutes later was a different story. His name was Dr. Kevin Marsh. He was 37, one of the senior physicians on staff, a favorite of Dr. Renner's because he was fast. He could see a patient, make a diagnosis, write a prescription, and move on in under 8 minutes. That was his specialty. Speed. Not care. Speed. Dr. Marsh walked in, glanced at the chart, and didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway with one foot already pointed toward the hall. He asked Raymond 2 questions. Where does it hurt? And how long? He didn't examine him. He didn't touch him. He looked at the chart, saw no insurance, and said, "Probably just acid reflux. I'll write you a prescription. You can fill it at the pharmacy down on Main. They do a discount for uninsured." Raymond said, "Doctor, the pain is in my left arm too, and I've been short of breath." Dr. Marsh barely looked up. He said, "At your age, could be a lot of things. Probably muscular. Take some ibuprofen. Come back if it gets worse." Then he made a note on the chart and walked out. Total time in the room was 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Raymond counted. But the real shock was still coming. Because what Dr. Marsh didn't know was that Raymond had a recording device. It was a tiny digital recorder, no bigger than a button, sewn into the lining of his coat. His lawyer had confirmed it was legal in Pennsylvania. One-party consent state. Raymond could record any conversation he was part of, and what Raymond recorded over the next 4 days would make national news. He didn't leave the hospital after that first visit. He came back the next morning, complaining of continued chest pain. This time, they admitted him because his blood pressure was actually high, 168/97, which was genuine. Raymond had stopped taking his own blood pressure medication 3 days before checking in, under the supervision of his personal physician who was monitoring him remotely. It was risky, but Raymond said he needed it to be real. They put him in a shared room on the 3rd floor. His roommate was a 71-year-old retired postal worker named Harold, who had come in for pneumonia and had been waiting 2 days for a follow-up chest x-ray that kept getting bumped. Harold was a gentleman, soft-spoken, with big square glasses and a habit of folding his blanket into a perfect rectangle every morning because, as he said, just because you're sick doesn't mean you stop being neat. Raymond and Harold talked for hours. Harold told him about his wife, Gloria, who came every afternoon at 2 o'clock with a thermos of homemade soup because the hospital food was, in Harold's words, an insult to the whole idea of eating. Gloria was 68, stout, wore a different colored headscarf every day, and called everyone sugar. She brought enough soup for both of them. But what happened in that room when the doctors thought no one important was listening was something else entirely. On the second night, 2 doctors stood in the hallway right outside Raymond's door. They didn't bother closing it. Why would they? The patients inside were just 2 old men with no insurance and no connections. Nobody who mattered. The first voice was Dr. Marsh. The second was a younger doctor named Dr. Alicia Voss, 32, a resident who had been at Millhaven for 2 years. Raymond lay perfectly still in his bed with his eyes closed and his recorder running. Dr. Marsh said something about the patient load being ridiculous. Dr. Voss agreed. Then Marsh said he was tired of wasting time on what he called charity cases. He said, and Raymond heard every word with perfect clarity, that patients without insurance should be stabilized and sent to county because Millhaven couldn't afford to babysit people who couldn't pay their bills. He said the old man in room 314, meaning Raymond, was probably just lonely and looking for a warm bed and 3 meals a day. Dr. Voss laughed. She said, "At least he's quiet. The guy in 309 keeps asking for a patient advocate. I told him we don't have one." They did have one. Her name was Margaret Fenn. She had been let go 6 months ago as a cost-cutting measure. Then Dr. Marsh said something that Raymond would never forget. He said, "Look, I don't make the rules. Renner wants us to move the paying patients through and manage the rest. That's the job. If they wanted better care, they should have made better choices. If they wanted better care, they should have made better choices." Raymond opened his eyes in that dark room and stared at the ceiling. Harold was snoring softly in the next bed. The hallway light made a thin yellow stripe across the floor. And Raymond thought about Corinne, about her lying in that hospital bed in Cleveland, about the billing clerk standing over her during chemo, about her call button left out of reach, about the look on her face when she realized that being sick made you invisible to the people who were supposed to help you. He thought about Deshaun, the 13-year-old boy in Teresa's letter who waited 9 hours with a broken arm. He thought about Harold, still waiting for a chest x-ray that kept getting pushed back. He thought about every person who had ever walked into a hospital hoping to be seen and was treated like they didn't matter. And he made a decision. But the biggest secret hadn't come out yet. Raymond stayed for 2 more days. He recorded 17 separate conversations. He recorded a billing meeting where Dr. Renner told his staff to prioritize what he called high-value patients and to expedite discharge for Medicaid patients to free up beds. He recorded a conversation between 2 nurses, not Teresa, complaining that they had been told to skip hourly check-ins on patients without private insurance to save time. He recorded Dr. Marsh telling a pharmacy tech to give a patient the generic version of a medication that the patient's chart specifically said they were allergic to, because the brand name cost the hospital more. That last one was the one that made Raymond's hands shake. Because if that pharmacy tech had listened, and if nobody had caught it, that patient could have died. On the 4th morning, Raymond got out of bed. He put on his worn canvas pants and his frayed flannel shirt and his broken zipper coat. He walked down to the lobby. He passed the coffee station with the 4 kinds of creamer. He walked up to the reception desk and asked to speak with Dr. Philip Renner. The receptionist, a young man named Craig, looked at Raymond's clothes and said, "Dr. Renner doesn't see patients directly. If you have a concern, you can fill out a comment card." He pointed to a small wooden box on the counter that was clearly decorative because it had a layer of dust on it. Raymond said, "Tell him Raymond Grant is here to see him, and tell him I own 31% of Ether Health Partners." Craig blinked. He looked at Raymond's torn coat, his cracked watch, his worn boots. He almost laughed. But something in Raymond's eyes stopped him. Something that didn't match the clothes at all. Craig picked up the phone. 7 minutes later, Dr. Renner came through the lobby doors. He was smiling that empty smile, ready to dismiss whatever this was. He looked at Raymond and said, "I'm told you claim to be Raymond Grant. I'm not sure what kind of game this is, but..." Raymond reached into his coat and pulled out his phone. He made 1 call. It rang twice. A voice on speaker said, "This is David Chen, General Counsel for Cornerstone Industrial." "Dr. Renner, the man standing in front of you is Raymond Grant, majority stakeholder in Ether Health Partners as of last quarter's acquisition. I'd suggest you listen to what he has to say." Renner's face went through about 4 different colors in 5 seconds. Raymond put his phone away. He looked at Renner and said very quietly, I've been a patient in your hospital for 4 days. Room 314. No insurance, no name you recognized. And I heard everything. Renner started to speak. Raymond held up one hand. You turned this hospital into a machine that sorts human beings by how much money they have in their pocket. You let doctors skip examinations on patients who couldn't pay. You cut staff until the nurses were too exhausted to care. You let a pharmacist almost give a man medication that could have killed him. And you sat in your office with your shiny shoes and your motivational poster and told yourself it was just business. Raymond's voice never rose above a conversational tone. That was the terrifying part. He wasn't angry. He was precise. My wife died in a hospital, Raymond said. She was a school teacher. She spent her life caring about people who couldn't give her anything in return. And when she got sick, the system treated her like she was an inconvenience, a cost, a number on a spreadsheet. He paused. He looked at the floor. Then he looked back at Renner. She told me to be useful, not just rich, useful. And I have been trying to figure out what that meant for 7 years. I think I finally understand. He reached into his coat pocket and set the small digital recorder on the reception desk. There are 17 recordings on this device. Your lawyers will want to hear them. The state medical board will definitely want to hear them. And if I don't see real changes in this hospital within 90 days, the journalists at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette will want to hear them too. Renner opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked like a man standing in a house that was falling down around him, and he had just realized he was the one who had knocked out all the supports. Now what Raymond did next was what nobody expected. Because he didn't destroy the hospital. He didn't fire everyone. He didn't call the press and make himself a hero. That wasn't what Corinne would have wanted. He rebuilt it. Within 2 weeks, Dr. Renner was removed as chief administrator. He wasn't fired publicly. Raymond gave him the option to resign. Renner took it. He packed his motivational poster and his shiny shoes and drove his white Mercedes out of the parking lot for the last time on a Friday afternoon. Nobody waved goodbye. Dr. Marsh was referred to the state medical board for review. The investigation into the medication error led to a formal disciplinary hearing. His license was suspended pending review. Dr. Voss was put on probation and required to complete 200 hours of patient advocacy training. She actually did it. She actually changed. 2 years later, she would become one of the hospital's most patient-centered doctors. But that came later. Raymond brought in a new administrator. Her name was Dr. Linda Ochoa, 54, a former rural health director from West Virginia who had spent her entire career fighting for underserved communities. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and sneakers under her white coat, and she had a sign on her desk that said, "Every patient is someone's person." She had no interest in coffee stations or profit margins. She had interest in people. He funded the hospital directly, not through Ether, through the Corinne Grant Foundation. $12 million over 3 years, earmarked for specific things. 20 new nursing positions, a rebuilt pharmacy with triple-check protocols, a patient advocate office with 2 full-time advocates, a transportation fund for patients who couldn't get to appointments, an emergency assistance program for uninsured patients. And one more thing, a children's wing. Millhaven General had never had a dedicated pediatric unit. Kids were treated in the same rooms as adults, with the same overworked staff, on the same stained mattresses. Raymond funded a complete children's wing with bright walls and new beds and a playroom with books and toys and a mural painted by students from the local high school. He named it the Deshawn Wing, after the 13-year-old boy who had waited 9 hours with a broken arm. Deshawn, who was now 14, was at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. He stood beside his mother with his arm perfectly healed and a grin so wide it took up half his face. And Teresa Colvin? Raymond found her on his last day as a patient. She was doing her rounds on the 3rd floor. He stopped her in the hallway and said, "Nurse Colvin, I want to thank you for your letter." Teresa stared at him. She looked at his torn clothes. She looked at his face. She said, "What letter?" He told her. He told her who he was. He told her what her letter had done. He told her that 3 paragraphs written on notebook paper by a single mother making $19 an hour had changed the course of 57 lives. because that was the number of staff who were rehired or newly hired because of the reforms. 57 people who had jobs because Teresa Colvin sat down at her kitchen table one night after her boys were asleep and wrote the truth to a stranger. Teresa put her hand over her mouth. Her eyes filled up. She said, "I didn't think anyone would read it." Raymond said, "The right person read it." He promoted Teresa to head of nursing within 6 months. She tried to say no. She said she wasn't qualified. Raymond said, "You're the only person in this building who wrote a letter to a stranger because you couldn't stand watching people get hurt. That's the only qualification I need. Stay with us, because what happens next will shock you." Harold, Raymond's roommate from room 314, finally got his chest x-ray. It showed early-stage pneumonia that had been worsening because of the delay. He was treated properly and released 2 weeks later. His wife, Gloria, came to the hospital every single day with her thermos of soup and her colored headscarves. On his last day, she brought a pot big enough for the entire nursing staff. She said, "Sugar, y'all saved my husband. The least I can do is feed you." Raymond kept his connection to Millhaven quiet. He didn't do interviews. He didn't put his name on the building. When a reporter from Pittsburgh found out and called him, Raymond said, "The story isn't about me. The story is about a nurse who wrote a letter and a hospital that remembered why it exists." But the moment that stayed with Raymond, the moment he thought about every night when he lay in bed in his same house in Shaker Heights, with Corinne's side still untouched, happened on the day the children's wing opened. He was standing in the hallway, watching kids walk into the playroom for the first time. A little girl, maybe 5, with 2 pigtails and a hospital bracelet on her tiny wrist, walked up to him. She was holding a stuffed bear that was missing one eye. She looked up at Raymond and said, "Are you a doctor?" Raymond knelt down. His knees cracked. His scar-knuckled hand rested on his knee. He said, "No, sweetheart, I'm not a doctor." "Then why are you here?" she asked. Raymond looked at that little girl with her one-eyed bear and her hospital bracelet, and he thought about Corinne, about her 3rd-grade classroom, about the shoebox of birthday cards under the bed, about the last thing she ever said to him. "Because someone I loved very much told me to be useful," he said, "and I'm trying my best." The little girl looked at him seriously. She held out her bear. "He only has one eye," she said, "but he still sees everything." Raymond took the bear gently. He looked at its one black button eye. He handed it back and said, "Then he's the smartest bear I ever met." The little girl smiled. She hugged the bear to her chest and walked into the playroom. Raymond stood up slowly, his eyes wet, his hands in the pockets of his plain coat. Teresa was standing behind him. She had seen the whole thing. She didn't say anything. She just touched his shoulder. And that was enough. Months later, Raymond sat on his back porch in Shaker Heights on a cool evening in October. The leaves were turning. The light was the color of honey. He was drinking burnt coffee from Mac's Diner, which he had brought home in a thermos because he liked the way it tasted even when it was cold. He had Corinne's photograph in his hand, the one from their wedding day. She was laughing in it. She was always laughing. He said, out loud, to nobody and to her, "I think I finally figured out what you meant, Corey. You didn't want me to save the world. You just wanted me to show up in one room for one person and act like they mattered, because they do." He put the photograph back on the side table. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. The coffee was cold in his hands. And Raymond Grant, 68 years old, billionaire, widower, man in a worn coat with a cracked watch, sat on his porch and felt, for the first time in a long time, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And that's where we'll leave this story. If it touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, what lesson did you take from this? See you next time.